Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be breaking down the numbers and looking at the new best and worst nations in top tier in Ground RB and War Thunder. So as some of you may or may not have already noticed, the StatShark website just wrapped up the month of July, which was the month in which the Leviathans update was released, and the Russian win rate at 12.0 has dropped to a whopping 40%, which is impressively bad. It's one of the lowest since the USA was at 40% earlier this year. So how did Russia and USA basically switch places in only a few months as the worst top tier nation? That is one of the questions that this little examination is looking to find out. Now, as a small disclaimer, the StatShark website is not entirely correct. It does have some limitations. However, the larger nations such as USA, Russia, and Germany do tend to have broadly the biggest data sets, and because they have the largest data sets, tend to have the fewest inaccuracies. So we will generally see some pretty good trending on those nations, although some of the data on minor nations might be a little off. Additionally, because StatShark actually wraps the previous month into the current month a little, there are going to be a few days of August in the July data. I tried to get the July data as quickly as it was available to basically try and get that out, but some of it will be a little bit contaminated. I don't think it'll be enough to throw out the broader numbers though. Now, as a small aside before we begin, one thing I do want to say is throughout the month of July was probably some of the most fun top tier has been since I started playing War Thunder a long time ago, and that is actually saying something. Now, if you don't generally like the playstyle of top tier, it is very fast paced, it is very lethal, a lot of things die very quickly. I seriously doubt the Leviathans update will dramatically alter your opinion of top tier. It is basically just a different playstyle, but that is, in my opinion, one of the good things about War Thunder is that the different battle ratings do have some pretty different playstyles. So most players will probably find at least some battle rating they enjoy, even if top tier isn't necessarily one of them. The purpose of this video is not to try to sell you on top tier, but just to annotate that for the people that do like the top tier experience and like the top tier playstyle, but have perhaps not exactly enjoyed the meta for the last few months, I did personally find July was a noticeable improvement. And as one final aside before we get on, a lot of people have been very quick to blame the T80 UE1s and also to blame obviously player skill, because that's exactly what happened when USA win rate tanked, and I'm going to try to avoid that because much like the USA win rate, I think the problem is probably more complicated than simply a single premium or the win rate. It's probably and more likely multifaceted, because also, as we'll see, a 40% win rate is so bad that it's actually statistically very improbable. Now obviously when you're doing data analytics, you want more than one data point, and even just having one data point for each individual entity is not enough. You want multiple data points for multiple entities. So what I did was I created this quick and dirty chart that we're going to be referencing that looks at the May, June, and July win rates for all of the 10 nations and the percentage change that they saw. And this actually tells a somewhat interesting story. In May, we have USA with a 43.5% win rate, Germany with a 48.5% win rate, and Russia with a 52.9% win rate. So here we have USA very clearly on the bottom, Russia clearly on the top, by about 10 percentage points, which is actually a very noticeable difference. As soon as we go into June, however, Russia's win rate immediately tanks by 7.5%. It goes all the way down to 45.4%. And the US win rate goes up by 4.1%. It goes up to 47.6%. Additionally, Germany also sees a minor bump as well, up to 50.7%. So June is actually not when Leviathans released. Leviathans released at the very end of June, so it didn't release in June. So the Leviathans update basically hadn't hit, and Russia already took a noticeable drop in their win rate, while USA and Germany saw a noticeable bump. And it wasn't until July when Leviathans hit proper that the numbers that we got stood up. Russia dropped all the way down to 40.4%, whereas USA went all the way up to 50.5%, and Germany went up to 53%. So now USA and Russia are separated by 10.1%, which is essentially the same situation they were in previously, but now inverted, and now Germany's on top. Scrolling through the minor nations real quick, although they won't be the principal focus, as I mentioned, they do have a much smaller data set, so it's more likely there are noticeable errors here, but all of the minor nations basically stayed roughly the same or saw a noticeable increase. Sweden ended up going all the way up from a 50.1% in May all the way up to a 57.7% in July for the highest win rate of any nation. Israel actually saw a much larger bump, however, because Israel went from 47.5% to 55.9%. 49%. So Israel went to less than 50% to well over a 50%, which is actually pretty impressive. With that being said, however, it is very notable that the major nations are actually the major determining factor in terms of how balanced top tier is. USA, Germany, and Russia together, each of them individually will make up as much of the matchmaker as all of the minor nations combined at any given moment. So USA, Germany, and Russia being internally balanced is actually a much bigger factor, and the minor nations can often get by with significant gaps in their lineups or capabilities because they're only usually 1 to 3 players in a given team, whereas the other 13 members of the team will often be major nations that can cover down on any gaps in their capabilities. So this allows even nations with fairly substantial gaps in terms of what they're able to do, Japan in particular, to have a 56.5% win rate, despite the fact that Japan does have some pretty glaring weaknesses because really it usually has other nations beside it that can cover those weaknesses. Conversely, if USA, Germany, or Russia has a major weakness, they're often going to comprise a sizable section of the team or even a majority of the team, so that means your team basically just can't do a given thing. So that's why these 3 nations in particular are often what I focus on when I'm looking at top tier balance, because ultimately if they are not balanced, then top tier is not balanced. And that's also part of the reason why I wanted to look at some of the potential issues with Russia, because while USA having a 40% win rate was certainly rough in terms of the top tier play experience, Russia, if it does sustain a 40% win rate, is going to be just as rough in terms of your overall play experience. Ultimately, it's not terrifically fun to spawn into a match, look at the little flags at the top, and immediately know who's going to win. Now, one little aside, and one thing I do want to draw your attention to, is while we did see a major shift in terms of win rates in June between USA, Germany, and Russia, and Leviathans hadn't actually hit yet as an update, one thing I will say is that the actual preseason for the update, which included things like dev blogs and the test server, all went live in June. So people generally knew roughly what was going to come out with the update and what they should prioritize. And long story short, this was not a particularly interesting or exciting update for Russia, but it was a pretty interesting update for a lot of the other nations. Russia only got the T-72B3A, which honestly, T-72s aren't exactly the best meta tanks at top tier right now. Russia did get the LDIRCMs added to the Mi-28NM helicopter. However, previously the Ka-52 helicopter was basically the top pick for most players because it has generally a better weapons loadout and a better damage model. The Meal line actually involves 3 helicopters that you wouldn't need if you were going up the Kamov line, so researching that entirely new line of helicopters for the essentially new meta helicopter, if you only had the Ka-52, would basically take you around 1,200,000 RP and around 3 million silver. So obviously, while you could definitely get the new helicopter, it would take some time and probably wouldn't be a very exciting journey. Meanwhile, quite a few other nations actually got brand new shiny AAs, and not just new shiny AAs, but a lot of them actually used new mechanics that were somewhat interesting, and most of the new anti-airs were fairly different from each other. And this also creates another problem because the experienced players that have multiple top tier lineups, researching another T-72 for Russia that you're probably not even going to bother playing once you have it fully spaded is not really a top priority. However, researching the new shiny anti-air for USA, Germany, Japan, Sweden, or Israel may be a much higher priority in terms of updating your top tier lineups. So the really experienced players that are likely to have multiple lineups probably weren't doing a lot of focusing on Russia going through June and through July. Now, how much this intangible factor does actually affect a win rate is kind of difficult to really put your finger on because, as it turns out, StatShark doesn't really track the average performance of the average player playing a given nation within a time frame, so you can't tell if the players that are playing are the best or not the best, and if only the top 2% of players leave, that could still negatively affect the win rate because those are the players that are more likely to carry a match because they're more likely to have multiple complete lineups, i.e. they're more likely to not simply have a 12.0 ground lineup, but also things like a Su-30 SM in their lineup as well. This also brings up another interesting aside because I was sort of expecting going into this that perhaps the rise of the new anti-airs negatively affecting the Su-30 SM's performance might be a contributing factor, and while it is certainly possible that it had some impact, because the majority of the impact came between May and June, i.e. before the new anti-airs were even out, it seems unlikely that that's contributing the majority of the factor. Certainly Iris-T's popping the occasional Su-30 SM before it even fires its salvo could certainly certainly turn the tide of a match or two, but whether or not that's having an impact on the overall matchmaker as a whole, not really any data pointing towards that conclusion. Now, a brief note for anybody that's not that familiar with the nuance of how statistical win rates work in these kind of shooter games is that inevitably things should gravitate towards the 50% range, and the further you get away from 50%, the harder it is to keep moving further away from 50%. For example, the lowest win rate of any single vehicle in all of War Thunder is 37%. So even though the vehicle is doing incredibly poorly, it still wins over a third of its games by accident because the other 15 players in the match are usually carrying you. So going all the way down to 40% is actually incredibly rough. It's a lot worse than it seems like it is on paper. Of course, this naturally leads into everybody's favorite scapegoat, the T80 UE1. There were some sales around the T80 UE1, so more of them entering the matchmaker could have had an impact, but as I kind of pointed out with the clickbait video, I'm not entirely convinced this has as much of an impact as people realize, but let's look at it by the numbers. In this chart, I included the clickbait, the 2A4M, and the T80 UE1, along with the squadron vehicles that are essentially their counterparts, because squadron vehicles don't really go on sale or anything, and all of them have been around for a while, so the squadron vehicles tend to have much more stable numbers than the premium vehicles that can see sizable fluctuations. Now, for reference, I did also put the kills per death for each of the vehicles below the vehicle's name for each month, because there is actually one thing I do want to annotate that, but I'll get to that in a minute. And as one final side note before we go into the numbers themselves, I'm using the total number of games for both the premium vehicles and the squadron vehicles of a given nation, but as I said in the clickbait video, these are not mutually exclusive, or to put that in other words, you could have a clickbait and an aim in your lineup and take both those out in the same game, and so you would essentially be doubling up. So it means these numbers are probably a little bit lower than what you're seeing here, but this is just to give you a general idea of how much these two types of vehicles are being played. So the clickbait and the M1A1 aim together played a total of 4.8 million games in May. The Leo 2A4M and the Leo PL both played a total of 1.7 million games in May, and the T80 UE1 and T80 UK both played a total of 3.2 million games in May. So obviously the clickbaits are definitely the predominant vehicle in this era. They have a total of 3.4 million games played total, more than anything else here. When you go into June, however, this is where it starts to get interesting, because while the clickbait and the aim together only increased the total number of games by about 40,000, basically an inconsequential number given some of the numbers we're dealing with, the Leo 2A4M and the Leo 2PL increased the number of games played by 1.7 million. Meanwhile, the T80 UE1 and T80 UK increased their numbers by about 1 million. This put the total number of vehicles that both Russia and USA had in the matchmaker in terms of the premium and squadron 11.7 MBTs at a pretty similar number. USA had 4.8 million, Russia had 4.2 million. Additionally, the T80 UE1s are now at 2.8 million, whereas the USA clickbaits are only at about 3.2 million. So Russia is actually closing in on USA fairly quickly, but I do want to note the number of increase in Germany was absolutely massive. There were a lot of extra 2A4M games in June. Now going into July, this is where it actually gets wild. The clickbait and the aim actually went down by 1.6 million games. Only 3.2 million games were played across those two vehicles. A lot less clickbait games were played, only about 2 million over a course of this period. The Leopards actually went up by another 125,000 for 3.5 million. So there were actually more Leopard 2A4M and Leopard 2PL games than combined clickbait and aim games. However, Russia saw the biggest increase. The T80 UE1 went all the way up to 3.6 million games, and the T80 UK, even though it did go down a little, still ultimately resulted in Russia having 4.6 million games across those two tanks, which was a pretty sizable increase of 352,000. So ultimately, what does that all mean? Well, the clickbait actually went down in usage very significantly, whereas the aim stayed pretty stable. So the total games between those two tanks leveled out a bit between May and June, and then dropped off pretty dramatically in July. The Leopards actually just kept going up and went up to a pretty substantial degree, basically more than doubling over the course of those 2 months. However, Russia went from about 3.2 million games to 4.6 million games, an increase of 1.4 million games. So actually a pretty massive jump, and the 3.6 million T80 UE1 games is really big. It's actually the most games of any vehicle on this comparison. So while on the surface this does lend some credence to the idea that the T80 UE1s have ruined the Russian win rate, they only went from 1.9 million to 3.6 million, whereas the Leopard 2A4M went from 850,000 to 2.6 million. So the Leopard 2A4M also saw a very sizable increase, but Germany actually went up in terms of performance, actually pretty noticeably, to the best out of the three. Additionally, USA actually went down very sharply in terms of both premium and squadron vehicle usage between June and July. And this begs the same question that I kind of asked in the clickbait video. If the influx of T80 UE1s is massively adversely affecting Russia, why is the influx of Leopard 2A4Ms not massively adversely affecting Germany? Certainly the numbers are not the same, but it was a pretty massive increase on both sides, and with USA actually going down in terms of overall premium usage, you would expect to see a huge bump in USA if the premiums were actually the problem. This is also where we get to the KD stat, because I was curious about this. The clickbait has been in the game longer than the other two premiums, so my assumption was that the average person looking at the clickbait, basically anybody who wanted it, had already bought it. Either when it came out they bought it at full price, or they had already experienced one of these several sales in which it was available. So I was assuming that the average skill level of the clickbait player had gone up, and I was entirely correct. Even in May, before the rise of new T80 UE1s and Leopard 2A4M players, clickbaits had already gone up to a 1.06 KD, and by the time you get to July it's at a 1.1 KD. This is in stark contrast to the Leopard 2A4M that had a KD of 0.97 in July, and even more so the T80 UE1 that had a KD of only 0.91 in July. Also, I would look at the squadron vehicles real quick. The M1A1 AIM actually did better than the squadron vehicles for either other nations. In fact, it did almost as good as some of the premium vehicles in some areas, which, as we kind of explored a little back with the clickbait video, is a little unusual. The squadron vehicles typically underperform. The M1A1 AIM ended July with a 0.96 KD, which is respectable. It's not amazing, but the Leopard PL had a 0.85 and the T80 UK had a pretty abysmal 0.8. So the obvious question is, what does this mean? Well, the most likely answer is that while the T80 UE1s coming into the meta did have some impact, they definitely weren't the overall driving factor, and a lot of this can be reasonably asserted because the 2A4M didn't have any negative impact at all on Germany. They seemed to do perfectly fine even with a large influx of players that weren't doing particularly great for grinding premium and squadron vehicles. So ultimately, I do feel like it's a stretch to say the T80 UE1s are the main cause of Russia's problems. If anything, they are definitely a contributing factor. However, it's hard to definitively say they are the main factor because we had already started to see some very sharp decline in June where the number increase wasn't anywhere near as bad. So briefly wrapping up my thoughts on Russia's biggest woes, and I personally, looking at this, think part of the problem is simply that this was a pretty underwhelming update for Russia, and this didn't combo well with an influx of new players in the T80 UE1, and certainly the new anti-airs probably didn't help matters either, since Russia did have some of the best casts in the game at that point. That being said, several of these issues are transient and will likely subside a bit within the next few weeks, so I expect August and September will see some bounce back. However, given that Russia had already started to take a hit in June, I have serious doubts they will ever go back to the 53% that they had before all of this. It seems more likely they're going to settle in a 45 to 47% range, somewhere around USA. With that being said, if we go through August and September and Russia is still sitting at a 40% win rate, that is a serious issue, and Gaijin will have to look at some potential solutions, although I have a sneaky suspicion that they will already be on that without me having to prompt them. Now this does kind of awkwardly segue into the next part of the video, where I'm mostly just going to be discussing some of my observations about the meta and how certain vehicles do or don't fit in it in certain roles. This is going to be less data driven and more experience driven, so feel free to take everything I'm about to say with a grain of salt, but this is simply what I've been observing in my games. As far as the MBT lineups and what you can reasonably expect out of a main battle tank at top tier, it's pretty clear at this point that the Leopards are the top dogs right now. The Statistical 122B+, Leopard 2A7V, and Leopard 2A7HU are all fighting for basically the spot of the best MBT in the game, and if you look at the top 10 MBTs at top tier right now, it is littered with Leopard 2s. This generally drives the meta to be more mobility centric, which I personally don't think is a bad thing. This is actually part of the reason why I've been enjoying the current Leopard meta more than I enjoyed the previous T-Series meta, because the Russian T-Series tanks are just very linear in their approach to a situation. The lack of reverse gear and poor reload mostly means they're basically just giant battering rams, and if that strategy doesn't work, they don't win. So it makes a lot of fights very simple steamroll fest, and that's about it. Whereas centering more around mobility allows more opportunities for more different vehicles to shine. Additionally, the advantage of the Leopard 2s is really just their versatility. It's not that they're crazy good in any one area, but more that they're not terrible in any area. But this does mean that if a vehicle has exceptional characteristics in one area, like a really fast reload or really good mobility, you usually have something to exploit in a fight against the Leopard 2, which is another part of the reason why I generally favor this meta more, at least in my personal experience. With that being said, and even considering that Leopard 2s are generally performing the best, I still think the turret basket nerf is pretty uncalled for and pretty awkward. It's one of several artificial nerfs and buffs that if the developers had come out and said we're doing this for gameplay reasons, I would feel very differently about it, but the fact that they try to rationalize it as being a realistic solution when it kind of isn't is really what rubs me the wrong way, and it didn't help that they basically did that entire line about hitting enemies center mass and not doing damage, when that does happen to Russian tanks basically just as often as it happens to things like Leopards and Abrams. The whole thing just felt very awkward in terms of how they handled it, and it feels a lot more like they're trying to balance the vehicles than make the vehicles realistic, which if they were to simply say that, I would be more fine with. I'm also going to say right now that despite an outstanding bug report for the blowout panel issue that I've mentioned in several videos, it is still an issue. If your blowout panels get hit, there is currently a bug where you basically, instead of losing all but one of your ammo, you basically just can't fire the gun at all until you go back to a capture point. This will result in you dying in scenarios that if this bug hadn't occurred you would otherwise survive, and it hasn't escaped my notice that basically no Eastern tanks, no T-Series tanks use blowout panels. It's basically only NATO tanks. The anti-air meta is a lot harder to speak on right now because it's still very much in a developing state. While the IRST is very powerful, it also has some pretty harsh limitations in that it's very big, very bulky, very hard to move, and obviously only has infrared missiles, which also brings up the LDRCM awkwardness. I'm still not entirely happy with putting in essentially a hard counter to all IR missiles on very specific helicopters. It makes the game way too rock, paper, scissors. I don't think always or never systems should really be in games because it creates a very uninteractive experience in my opinion, and this is also not counting the realism aspect in that this is more efficient than a real-world LDRCM system realistically should be. With that being said, most nations right now have an option to take out a plane, assuming that plane is even a little careless, so this does make the situation a lot more favorable than it was previously, especially because intercepting salvos of missiles is actually a lot more viable than it used to be as well. So the air environment, while still more toxic and uninteractive than I would generally like it to be, is not anywhere near as bad, and again, that's been a major contributing factor to why I haven't really hated the month of July as much as I previously did. Previously, if a Su-30SM fired a salvo of KH-38MTs, you would just kind of be eating it on the chin. However, now there is a chance that your teammates save you from some or all of those missiles. The light tank meta at top tier right now is somewhat interesting because the single shot cannons that can actually punch through the front of most tanks, or at least punch through some weak points, tend to generally do the best, at least a lot better than the missile carriers. And a lot of this is really boiling down to, if you round a corner and you see an MBT staring directly at you, the single shot guns do have a chance to deliver a shot that kills the MBT first, whereas the autocannon missile carrier combo doesn't really have that capability. So vehicles like the Centauro RGO, the CV9120, the VT5, and to a lesser extent things like the HSTVL have been performing better than vehicles with autocannons like the CV90 Mark IV, the Puma VJTF, and the Nomers Recon. Speaking of, this does bring up a few awkward points of frustration when using some of these spike missile carriers. The first one is the spikes themselves. A lot of vehicles with spikes are close to a full battle rating above where they would be if they didn't have spikes, and yet the spikes themselves are wildly inconsistent, often hitting parts of the enemy vehicle that don't even make sense. I've fired 2 spikes in rapid succession, and one hit the front of the fender and the other one hit the back of the engine. I don't even know what the targeting logic is on these missiles. They're not hitting anywhere near the same spot 2 times. You can fire 4 spike missiles at an enemy and it'll hit 4 completely different locations, and this isn't even counting the awkwardness when the spikes somehow don't do any damage because it hit the roof ERA on a Russian tank, so that one brick of contact 1 somehow stopped 1,000 millimeters with a tandem warhead, which sure, whatever. Most of these spike vehicles only have a total of 4 missiles. With the CV90 Mark IV it does go up to 6, but this does mean you have 4 missiles and you're probably going to get at most 1 kill. It seems very weird for these vehicles to be so elevated in battle rating for a capability that is so inconsistent. I wouldn't completely hate it if they did add a reload to the spike missiles and ammo box that you see on things like anti-aircraft systems, but I doubt they're really going to implement that. With that being said, that is one of the reasons why I personally like the German Boxer Wilkes, because yes, it has spike missiles and yes, it has an autocannon, but once you fire the spikes, you're still a fast-wheeled vehicle with an autocannon. You can still easily get into flanking shots and shred enemies from the side, whereas some of the slower vehicles, specifically the Nomers, are so limited in their role that if you sit back and fire spikes, you're probably not going to really be doing much once your spikes have been expended. You have to basically go for the flanking position right away because you're just too slow to try and affect it later in the map. So having more mobile vehicles with the autocannon spike combo definitely does pay off noticeably better. Speaking of the Nomer 30 and the Nomers Recon, I have no idea when they're going to fix the weird bug where if hitting any of the electronics on the outside of the vehicle completely disables all of your gun systems. I don't know how that made it onto the vehicle in the first place, and I don't know why it's still there. It is such a comically stupid buff that it blows my mind that it was ever even added to the vehicle in the first place. It is insanely easy to completely disable that vehicle's ability to return fire compared to all of these other autocannon spike combos, and I have no idea for the life of me why that is there. And speaking of spike missile vehicles with bug damage models, hopefully at some point the Puma VJTF will get its damage model fixed so that hitting the spike missiles doesn't completely blow up the entire turret and both of the tracks for some reason. This still happens, and this seems like this should be a really easy bug to fix because it makes less than no sense. But the Puma VGTF at this point is often just a repair simulator where you spend half the map just fixing every system because it gets knocked out every time either of the spikes gets hit. Now moving on to the helicopter meta, and the helicopter meta is actually kind of weird right now because obviously you do have the spike missile carriers, things like the AH-60, the Tigers, etc. But then you also have the aircraft with LDIRCMs. So if you're in something like the German Tiger UHT and all you have are the PARS IR missiles and the Mistral IR missiles, you basically can't kill an Mi-28NM or a Z-10ME at all. Like if you just run into either of these LDIRCM helicopters, they will just kill you because you can't hurt them. It is a very weird meta to find yourself in, especially because the spikes used to be almost idiot-proof against enemy helicopters, and now there are 2 very specific helicopters that you need to be able to recognize basically on sight that you cannot hit at all, and you should basically just run away or try to find a position to use your guns to engage them. This in turn actually does put a premium on your helicopter still having a usable gun. This is one of the reasons why I think the Tiger HOD Block 2 for France is a lot better than the Tiger Hawk for France, as while they both have pretty similar missiles, the Hod Block 2 has that 20mm cannon, so not only can it bullfight other planes, but it still has at least some potential to take out enemy helicopters with LDIRCMs that the Tiger Hawk really doesn't. This also does bring up another interesting point in terms of planes, in that while yes, there is a more intensive anti-air threat that does have fire and forget missiles that if they lock on you at all can potentially hit you, you also spawn a lot further away from the battlefield if you spawn in the air, and this does leave for more room and more interesting dogfight scenarios than you had previously. Previously, if you got into a dogfight in another plane, a lot of times you'd be doing so within line of sight of the map, and one of you would just get plastered by an anti-air before you got to resolve it. But now I actually do find you get more one-on-one fights with aircraft a lot more often, which is actually pretty interesting. Additionally, because you have these anti-aircraft systems like the IRIS-T that are multi-vehicle systems that don't move well, it does incentivize including at least some kind of GPS glide bomb on your aircraft if you can afford it. The F-15E for USA and F-15I for Israel are probably some of the better examples, because you can just slap some GBU-39s under the central fuselage and just throw those at an IRIS-T and fly away and see if any of them connect, and if they don't, no loss. They're not exactly great weapons against moving enemy tanks anyway. With all that stuff in mind, however, basically every nation has access to an aircraft that has both some sort of guided weapons and also Fox 2 and Fox 3 missiles, and can carry all of them at the same time. So you do end up in scenarios where there's a lot more missiles coming at you basically a lot more of the time right now if you do take an aircraft up in ground RB. What this ultimately means is that while I wouldn't say aircraft are useless, the power level of aircraft is at a much more stable level, because obviously they are expensive to spawn, they spawn further back. The air threat is something that you have to respect, and you might even have to dump your first ordnance load taking out some anti-air to clear the airspace a little, and then you also have to contend with enemy fighters that can try to ambush you at any point in this process. So I think the power level of air is at a much more stable level than it used to be, but I don't think it's useless. I don't think the IRIS-T should go up to something like 13.0. I've taken out more than enough IRS-Ts that I'm not really that concerned about it being too powerful of an anti-aircraft system. It just requires you to fly differently when you know IRIS-Ts are around. Additionally, if you are used to flaring things like AIM-9Ms or R-73s, then it's not like the IRIS-T's IRCCMs on its missiles are significantly better. So as long as you know how to fly in a top-tier environment in air RB, you also know how to fly in a top-tier environment in ground RB. Now, as one side note about the air meta in ground RB, when I first did the top-tier review series, the highest battle rating for a ground vehicle in War Thunder was 11.7, and the highest battle rating for an air vehicle in ground RB was 12.7. What this essentially meant is that if you didn't take a high tier plane into your ground RB lineup and kept it at 11.7, there was a limit to the number of the highest power planes you could actually see in a given match. Additionally, at the time, the premium and squadron ground vehicles were all 11.3, so they couldn't see these powerful planes in a match at all. Then Gaijin made the rather weird choice of moving up the top ground vehicle battle rating to 12.0, but not changing the air battle rating. And you see this reflected in a little when I have the Germany top tier review, because that was the case at the time. This had two pretty decidedly negative effects in my opinion on how you played ground RB, because number one, it meant you almost needed a plane with Fox 3 missiles because you were almost certainly going to fight the best aircraft, and a lot of the anti-air at the time really struggled to handle them. It also had another knock-on effect in that it made a lot of the high-tier premiums kind of worthless because they were 11.7 and these oppressive planes were 12.7, so you could see planes that you had basically no chance against in a lineup that didn't have access to any anti-air, much less air. Now, Gaijin has moved the top air up to 13.0 and even moved some of the better helicopters to 12.3. Personally, I think this is actually a really good idea, and I think this creates a much healthier environment because you don't necessarily need a super high-end plane now. You can just settle with the anti-air, and the new anti-airs are pretty capable. However, if you do want to play a powerful plane, you do have that option, and you will be confronted with more powerful enemies to boot. So overall, I think this and the fact that now if you're playing one of these 11.7 premium vehicles, you're not running into things like Cage 38 MTs every match, is actually pretty good and pretty healthy for the game. And I would love it if they kept this separation of one battle rating between the top ground and the top air basically indefinitely. Ultimately, when I am building a ground RB lineup, I do like it when there is a meaningful choice between what type of plane I take instead of just taking the best one because you're going to fight the best enemy planes anyway. Of course, that also brings to one minor, well, not so minor side note that I know a lot of people would have expressed some frustration with, and that is the nuke planes in top tier. When you have systems like the Slam Ram, like the Iris-T, you have Fox 3 missiles, you have missiles that are hard to flare in general, having something like a Jaguar is just not going to cut it for delivering a nuke. While I'm not necessarily saying the nuke plane should be anything crazy, it should at least be something that is reasonably quick and has basic flares, certainly something a lot better than the current range of nuke planes that we have available. Overall, I would say the top tier meta is more ground and specifically MBT centric than it used to be, not to a huge degree, but it is noticeable. And additionally, while aircraft can definitely have an impact, they do have to pay attention. They can't just fly towards the battlefield, launch on 30 munitions, and go back to the airfield and call it a day, like they used to be able to, especially aircraft like the Su-34 and Su-30SM. So I do think it is a much healthier balance than it used to be prior to the July update. If you were to ask me what my picks for the best nation right now is in ground RB, I would have to go with Germany. Germany has an excellent main battle tank lineup. I find the light tanks are still pretty usable. The Iris-T, if you can get it set up, is an excellent anti-air, easily one of the best in the game. The Typhoon is still a very capable strike fighter, and the Tiger UHT, while it does have some limitations, can still get the job done in most cases. It's just a very flexible, well-rounded lineup where you don't really have any major weaknesses. While Sweden does throw up some pretty good numbers, I do find the pretty noticeable lack of air in Sweden actually does handicap it, especially if you get longer maps where air is increasingly relevant. The Gripen and the AHS just are really not cutting it at this point in the meta. They feel very underpowered. They can still get some work done, but it is pretty anemic. There are some other countries that I think are reasonable contenders. Israel, in my opinion, has become a very strong contender in the last few patches. The Spider anti-air kind of rounds out the package. The Nommers are not the best, but the Merkavas have been doing quite well statistically lately, and I do find the 5-second reload combined with the excellent forward and reverse gears and the somewhat beefy internal damage model do tend to make the Merkavas a pretty respectable threat on the battlefield. And then in the air, you have the F-16C, the F-15I, and the AH-60, all of which are very capable strike aircraft. I feel like Israel might be one of the more underrated nations right now in ground RB, and their win rate has kind of supported that. One nation that I do feel is a sleeper hit that's only missing one really good option in order to really pop off is, surprisingly enough, probably Italy. I would have to get a lot more time with it, but it really looks like the only thing Italy's missing is an anti-air. The Leopard 2A7 HU is good, its air options are good. It also has quite a few very mobile light tanks that it can use, but the Automatique just not cutting it at all. So if Italy gets a really good anti-air, it might be in serious contention. In that vein, France would also be a very serious nation if it got a good anti-air, because France does have some of the most powerful air in the game, only really being competed with by Russia. The Rafale is pretty busted, the Tiger Hod Block 2 also incredibly good, and on the ground you still have the Leclercs and the Leopard 2A6, which are very mobile MBTs with fast-firing guns on the Leclercs and some pretty trolly armor. The light tank lineup with the Vectra actually pretty solid. I was surprised at how well the new shell increases it. Overall, I think France is actually in pretty serious contention if it does get a good anti-air, and if it got a good anti-air and it got a good light tank like the Jaguar, I think France might really be cooking with gas. Of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. Let me know what you think about the Russian 40% win rate, about what you think about the top tier meta in general, which nations you think are the strongest. I always love to hear from you guys. If you liked the video, you found it informative, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.